Todd Cherniawsky is the production designer for Star Trek Picard on CBS All Access, after having previously worked on Star Trek Discovery. How is this experience different from a creative standpoint, or was it different?
There was a substantial difference creatively and then obviously narratively. So on top of that, just being, Discovery was starting from scratch. It was a series that essentially was spanning, pre-TOS, but of course, the original series with William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and then, kind of post-Enterprise. So it was a new territory with a new appetite, I think, a much more contemporary appetite for visuals and kind of a look. Whereas Picard, it's very clear it's 20 years later from a very established canon. So to be respectful of the franchise, there was a much clearer starting point compared to Discovery, which was starting all over again.
And how much creative inspiration did you take from the sets from Star Trek The Next Generation and the films from The Next Generation? Like, what was the jumping off point for all those?
The jumping off point for Picard visually was without a doubt examining Herman Zimmerman's production design work on TNG, many of the movies. That was, again, a very, very established system, which is very, very well liked and very precious to the fan base. So the ability to stray or take a 90-degree angle presented itself intermittently as we were introducing maybe new technology, new depth to backgrounds of new or not, very beloved species. So there was a lot to jump off of, and there was several people on my crew, but then also one of the writers, Kirsten Beyer, is a walking dictionary of the history of Star Trek. So having that ability to have the access and be very, very true to Herman's original stuff, and then also the canon narratively, gave us a lot of opportunity to have a really good foundation.
And it seems like one of the biggest challenges might be like the idea that you're setting a story in like the future from where The Next Generation and those films took off, but like 20 years ahead. So you have to kind of imagine where technology would be a little later, but not like drastically far ahead in the future. Like, were those details sort of difficult to imagine and sort of find that blend of contemporary to what those Next Generation details were and what the future technology might be past that?
Taking the chronology of 20 years into account, we can only imagine how even more advanced and quickly technology starts to take leaps and bounds. If we think back 20 years to the year 2000, we were just only on the verge and the start of what could be deemed a smartphone. The BlueBerry was all the rage, and it's probably as far as its adapted rate throughout usage. So 20 years later, things have changed drastically. Internet speeds have moved up, etc. Now there'll come a point at which where we can't get faster. But I think we still have to take 20 years into the account to, take some bigger leaps. And, what was fortunate for us is TNG was anchored to what would the future be look like in its time, whereas we are, of course, looking further. A lot of those technologies that were proposed in TNG, we have them already, so we don't have to wait to the 23rd century to have some of those. So those abilities we tried to scale up, and just following a lot of futurists' work as far as where things are going to be, maybe even in 100 years, we started to kind of just overlay those into the visual history of the TNG.
And one of the most iconic locations in sort of the Star Trek canon is the Borg cube, which you get to recreate for Picard. What was it like reimagining that, or building off of what we've already seen of that in the past?
Revisiting the Borg was a bit of a tricky thing because it is so well established, and it's got a very, very kind of distinct look. Again, that Herman Zimmerman helped, and his crew helped define. What I think we wanted to do was that this was essentially another almost even further evolved and aggressive Borg cube, one that had not been seen before, that had kind of a history but was really unknown in one of the narrative storylines of Picard. So the fact that it was secretive, undiscovered, and any time it had made any contact with any species, there was no record of what this thing looked like or felt like, other than one character in Picard. So that was a little tricky to take a bit of, as I would say, not a 90-degree angle, but maybe a 45-degree angle to what had been established with the Borgs, which was extensive amount of tubes, pipes, kind of a futurized steampunk look to a certain extent. And although we wanted to keep that in the Borg themselves, we wanted the feel a little bit different, and essentially be completely made out of smart material, kind of the purest of the pure Borg components, as opposed to kludged and I think retrofitted with other species technology. John Eves was very key in working with myself, Scott Schneider, another great concept set designer, in establishing what would become kind of our Minecraft play set, almost a Lego play set for the entire Borg cube interiors.
In any Star Trek series, like a starship setting is always an important factor. And here we get a new ship, the La Sirena, that Captain Rios' ship, which has a very different feel, of course, from starships we've seen in the past. What was it like creating that space that's very personal to Rios as a character, in addition to its function?
Yeah, the conceptualization of La Sirena started with the character of Rios. And we were fortunate enough to know enough of his backstory to kind of let that kind of work into kind of the narrative design. And I guess the analogy that I wanted is that, Rios was kind of a warehouse of memories and had an extensive collection of skeletons in his closet. So the idea of his ship, rather than being a compartmentalized and divided up, which would work equally as well as far as how he would kind of partition his memories, good and bad, it felt like it just needed to be this open, undefined black space. So that was the idea, was essentially, what does a warehouse in space look like? And then that built upon the fact that he was, the ship was being used to deliver freight. It was a tug, essentially a rig in space. So there were a variety of huge influences, predominantly maybe the Nostromo from Alien. I think it's kind of the bar for many of us who get to work in science fiction and science fantasy. I think this is, again, such an established general vernacular. It's hard not to kind of look at that as a great place to start with. But our ship was very, very different, which is essentially the bowels were on the top and the cleaner spaces were kind of down, as if the amount of, I guess, the purity of Rios was in this smaller core of health and science, and where he grew his plants and little vegetables. So there was a lot of things as far as reapproaching how you would generally do a ship. But the exterior, because this was not a Federation vehicle, we had the latitude to look outside of that. So we still made it terrestrial, essentially using maybe decades, if not century-old technology. So the equivalent of a tugboat that's been in service for 100 years. I think we were saying that the ship was roughly 50 years old.
And the way the story unfolds throughout the season, it does take Picard and the crew on to a number of different locations and very wide-ranging locations, from Free Cloud to Vashti to Nepenthe, and then of course Soji's homeworld at the end. Like, did you know going in to the season that there would be such a wide variety of settings and looks, and to try and bring them all together and make them distinct, but also feel like a unified show?
I had a reasonably clear idea of what the season would unfold for us, us being the art department. But of course, once you get to the challenges of each situation, it definitely got tougher and tougher along the way, because when you're world building and trying to create all these unique situations, it's very challenging to kind of build scale and scope, when you're in your backyard, because our backyard of Los Angeles, Ventura, and Orange counties have been shot so extensively. So in order to utilize those same areas, but maybe in a newer or hopeful way, your time is limited to really get into the depth of how to be able to do those changes and differences. And world building is tough on a feature film, so to have it on a television schedule, it definitely pushed the art department every day to try to deliver things that were reasonably unique, but still, of course, very respectful of the original show.
And how much of creating these locations, how much of that is like building physical sets, and how much is extended or created with the help of visual effects, and where's that line drawn to keep things nice and seamless?
As always, even in visual effects driven films, TV shows, the whole genre, as much as possible that can be provided for the actors and the crew, the better. Virtual sets, digital set extensions are a fantastic tool, but like anything, they are just a tool. So working very closely with the showrunners, Alex Kurtzman at Secret Hideout, all of his people, all the creatives, in trying to find the fine line as far as what their intentions, what their appetites for how to do these general processes, then having the opportunity to collaborate with a great visual effects coordinator, great DPs, costume designers. It all starts to kind of come together as far as what you want to stick into the digital extension, or the digital world, the virtual world, versus keeping practical. I think what we were fortunate with Picard is it gave us enough resources, not time-wise, but we definitely had, the fiscal resources to help keep that quite elevated, and then make a decision for both budgetary reasons, but also narrative reasons, what we would put onto stage and what we would do on location, and where that fine line is, and keeping a language to that so that you're not bouncing, the viewer's not seeing technique or process that bounces around too much or almost becomes schizophrenic, that you kind of follow a pattern of using those digital tools versus practical, so that the viewer still stays with the characters.
And one of the most memorable scenes of the season, it doesn't take place in a kind of physical reality. It takes place in sort of Data's consciousness, where he and Picard, by the end of the season, sort of meet and come to terms. What was it like creating that, like a physical space to represent that kind of imagined virtual space?
Sure. I think the bookends of Picard, the two bookend scenes in the first episode and the last episode between Admiral Picard, by the end of the season, and Data, his best friend, who essentially sacrificed himself right in front of Picard's eyes. That opening dream and then the final Dataverse imagining augmented reality, virtual reality space were easily two of my favorite scenes to do and work on. In the case of the first one, you're revisiting one of the great sets from TNG, again, Herman Zimmerman, designer. So being able to recreate even just a small portion of 10-4 was fantastic. Lisa Alcafer, our decorator, got a chance to rebuild those tables, the chairs, and just having that opportunity to draw that set up again and build even just a corner of it. It was not only fantastic for us, but to watch Sir Patrick Stewart and the rest of the cast show up and see that space was quite a treat. I think then for Dataverse, that was one of those moments where you read the sequence, and I believe it just read Dataverse. So of course my mind initially went to the traditional white void undefined space. Then does it make more sense to go dark? And then you realize, no, it has to be a creation of something. And it became very clear that what made sense was to kind of do a monochromatic version of the study from Picard Chateau, which also took, carried on through the season as a quote unquote virtual space in its holodeck, basically on La Serena. So to find, the right pulse, Ian McFadden, my supervising art director, first came up with the idea that maybe we should go in this direction, just painting it all white. And then the more we thought about it, we realized that if it had an overtone and a similarity to Data himself, so we went with a kind of a gunmetal silver aluminized metallic paint and duplicated all the expensive items on set. Lisa Alcafer, set decorator, and her crew duplicated as many of the projects are the large pieces, larger furniture pieces as closely as possible, painted those. A handful we just couldn't replace, found cheap imitations. So there's, some minor continuity discrepancies, but it was definitely a race to the finish line on that, because that was one of those ideas that you didn't want to make a short-sighted decision. So we all had a chance to mull it over, and until the 11th hour, or when we finally made that call, we went forward with it. And to this day, it's one of the most complimented kind of set pieces, is the way I look at it, especially by the fan base. I think those are very well written, very well performed, and I think the visuals that the art department came up with, I think, are not only an imitation, but then also I think a nice build on what we've seen in the past.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the show, and thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for doing this. All the best, and stay safe.
Yeah, you too.